qualidade da empresa. E aí, então, vocês que estão feitos em português e inglês, estão acompanhando online e a gravação surgiu. Thank you very much, Tom. And welcome also in my trip to made very welcome here in Rio, and I'm very thankful for that. This is my last night in Rio for a while, but hopefully I would like to come back in the future. Okay. This paper is probably the backdrop to this presentation because it's an example of what I would call an empirical study, in the sense that we're going into the field, we're collecting material using a whole variety of methods to look at the EU law, European Union law, requiring country by country reporting of payments to governments by extractives. Technically, this law does talk about country by country reporting. Actually, it's not technically country by country reporting in the sense of Richard Murphy's original formulation of country by country reporting. But I will explain that later. This paper was written when the United Kingdom was part of the EU and naturally enough would implement EU law. Yes. However, this law is still operational in the UK, although there are big efforts by the UK government to throw out all EU law and then reintroduce laws, some of which will be very similar to the EU laws. So it takes up their time. It takes up their time. So that will be the backdrop of it. And if you remember in previous presentations, I spoke about how Jeremy Bentham, the English philosopher who lived from 1748 to 1832, saw accounting and accounting publicity, making things visible to the public, accounting publicity, and bookkeeping, all kinds of record keeping. He saw accounting as something that was incredibly important in the world, incredibly important as a principle of governance. And one of the famous quotes that I gave was from a letter that Jeremy Bentham wrote to the famous agriculturalist Arthur Young, in which he wrote that with this thing, bookkeeping, all things were possible, and without it, very little was possible. Kind of exaggeration. And he also says, the cries of the accounting publicity he uses almost interchangeably in his writing. Of course, he was writing before the formal formation of an accounting profession in the 18th century. So the theme is going to be accounting, poverty, and the resource curse. So we'll move on to the second slide now. The one called intro. It's all right. This paper was published in Critical Perspectives on Accounting in 2020. And you can see my co-authors there on it. Okay, thank you very much. So have we got the thing too? Or you can move them if you want. It's okay. Yeah, it's fine. Oh, that's it though. Okay, thank you. So as an introduction to this, I want to ask the question, does accounting have a role in mitigating the resource curse? Now, what is the resource curse? According to many writers, especially in economics, the resource curse is the situation where a country might be very rich in natural resources. So it has lots of minerals, mines, maybe oil, gas. And in spite of having these resources, it appears to be the case that the country, in terms of the local population, is worse off than it would have been had it no resources, had it no natural resources. So it's almost a curse to have natural resources, when you would expect the opposite. You would naturally expect the opposite. And the theory is that because they have natural resources, they do not innovate, they do not put lots of money into infra, they just rely on the natural resources. There's also a theory that in bringing in overseas companies to, for example, help with the production of the oil or the refinement of the oil, very little money goes from those companies to the local government or local governments. There's also a theory that the money that does go is used corruptly. In other words, it's used by an elite within the country, maybe politicians, maybe civil servants, and does not find its way into the local population's benefit, for the local population's benefit. So there's all different ways in which the resource curse might apply in practice. And there's a general kind of understanding of the resource curse, which is simply that the country does not do as well as you would expect with the resources. And I mean, there is a number of countries throughout the world that are in this position, that appear to be relatively impoverished in spite of having rich in resources. Nigeria is a good example. Nigeria is a very full of resources in Nigeria, but the local people relatively poor. So that's a good example. And there are smaller African countries where this also applies. In Asia, I think a good example might be Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan, local people relatively impoverished, lots of resources. And there are many examples of this. Now, around the turn of the millennium, rather consistent with Jeremy Bentham's logic, so around 1990 to in the early 2000s, many non-governmental organizations and charities started to push for transparency, disclosure, a form of accounting, if you like, and much of it was related to companies, accounting disclosures of companies, and they push for these disclosures to mitigate the global social, economic, and environmental problems. And this included issues like the resource curse. So what were they pushing for? If you think of a country, it will pay various amounts to governments. that money. So for me, the kind of accounting that we're talking about here is definitely a form of financial accounting. But interestingly enough, the International Accounting Standards Board does not properly give attention to this. The campaigners that I'm talking about what is now called the Natural Resources Governance Institute is an NGO, used to be called Revenue Watch, because it was looking at the revenue received by the governments from companies. Transparency International, famous one. Hi. Global Witness, another famous NGO, and there are others. In fact, these bodies collected the support of approximately 100 bodies throughout the world. 100. Publish what you pay. Publish what you pay. Companies should publish what they pay to governments. At the same time, governments themselves in these things. You will remember, for example, the United Nations and the Millennium Goals. And such things also reflect these kind of pressures. And there was an initiative known as the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which involved collaboration between governments, companies, and non-governmental organizations. So a real kind of international by Clare Short, one of Tony Blair's cabinet ministers. And Clare Short actually became the president of the EITI later. This was voluntary in the sense that it required the collaboration of the companies and the government involved. But lots of governments signed up to it, managed to persuade companies in the area to do it, and it still exists. All governments throughout the world to require this disclosure. They wanted this to be an requirement rather than voluntary. They call it mainstreaming, making this voluntary law, sorry, this voluntary regulation a compulsory regulation. Think about what they're asking here. Now, the International Accounting Standards Board were put under pressure by the campaigners. Really a lot of pressure. Because there were media articles. They had a very famous investor involved in this process. They actually put the International Accounting Standards Board under a lot of pressure. They wanted the International Accounting Standards Board to introduce a standard requiring this disclosure. But think about what they're asking. They're asking different categories or types. The main one you imagine is taxation, but it's not just taxation. It's the fees, the licenses, the patents, all the different kinds of patents, all the different kinds of payments, sorry. And they wanted the detail to be disclosed for a given company, but for all governments. So think of a spreadsheet where on arguing is, with all this different information, pressure will be put on the companies because they have to show what they disclose. And if it's not a lot, they will be put under pressure. Pressure will be put on the governments because they will have to be accountable for what they do with the money. And as I mentioned before, the governments were also interested in this issue. And even, for example, contracts is like all the detail of the individual contracts. The disclosure. And projects is like a bundle of contracts, say in a particular region, in a particular area. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, at the moment we're still on the first slide. Sorry. Okay. So it was quite amazing, really, when you think about it, that the Obama administration in the US, Sarbanes-Oxley, sorry, not the Sarbanes-Oxley legislation, it was the Dodd-Frank stock exchange. US stock exchange or US stock exchanges. This information was required by the Obama administration. Quite extraordinary that not contracts, not projects, but different types, all governments. The information was not audited. But that was a kind of modification to the legislation, supported, I think, by a number of Democrats and Republicans in the United States. Now, this is an extraordinary development for that to be legally required. As a matter of fact, in the United States, in practice, it's hardly happened because companies have objected to it. And they've taken cases to the legal courts to say this is an invasion of privacy, this is too much. This is too much disclosure. And not a lot has happened in practice. But the point is that the legislation was passed, that the Securities and Exchange Commission in the United States was working on this project, this proposal, if you like, this legislative requirement to require companies to do this. So the campaigners have been putting pressure on all kinds of bodies. They've been putting pressure on governments. They've been putting pressure on the stock exchanges of the world as well, because stock exchanges have their own rules for disclosure by companies. And they've also been putting pressure on the accountancy bodies. And the International Accounting Standards Board, as I mentioned before, was put under a lot of pressure, but in the end, they thought it was pragmatic, what they call it realpolitik. And I interviewed people on the IASB about this, and they call it realpolitik. They said, we can't do this. If we do this, if we require companies to do this, they won't follow our standards at all. And they will also list on stock exchanges, such as the Japanese stock exchange, that does not require the international accounting. So they were quite serious about this, you know. But one man at the ISB said to me, he was actually from South Africa, and he said, I agree that this disclosure is good. I agree with what is behind it. You know, the idea of developing the local society. I agree with that. No problem. But really, it's realpolitik. We can't do this. To be honest with you, you should get someone else to do it. If someone else requires it, we are happy. We are really happy. But we can't do it. That's what he said. Which is an interesting kind of statement reflecting the kind of global politics of these things. If anyone tells you accounting is not political, that's one case for it. There are many others we could give. The International Accounting Standards Board says nothing about accounting disaggregation. One of the presidents of the International Accounting Standards Board says, we tell it like it is. That's what we're about. We tell it like it is. We're telling the facts. But you ask them about disaggregation, like, for example, are you going to disclose everyone's wage? Oh, no, we're not going to do that. You know, are you going to disclose all the detail of all these payments to different governments? No, we can't break down the detail. Costs and benefits. So telling it like it is, when you're talking about aggregating or disaggregating, is a political issue. And there may be other issues, but it's mainly political. Okay. So that's a bit of background on that. But, you know, these campaigners are all assuming that transparency is the issue. Transparency will do so much good. But there is a literature in accounting which has done a critical appraisal of transparency, which has looked, if you like, at the dark side of Jeremy Bentham. And there's a lot of material on the dark side of Jeremy Bentham. Because ideas like transparency can be captured and they can be put to quite negative uses. And transparency can be a kind of illusion. And there is transparency and transparency. Let's have a look at some of the points that people make. it just makes the point here that in the 20th century, there was an increase in critical assessments with the growth of an accounting academia that, especially in the UK, but now much more worldwide. And I want to acknowledge the Anglo-centric nature of that point, you know, because there have been critical movements all over the world, and that's not, it's not reasonable to put it like that, to argue that, you know, especially in the UK. I mean, it is the case that every UK accounting institution, pretty much every academic centre in the UK has some critical writers in accounting or some critical and qualitative writers in accounting. That's true, but it does not imply that UK was the only place where critical work came about. Significantly influenced by interdisciplinary and critical perspectives, and some key journals were established, like Accounting Organizations and Society, Critical Perspectives on Accounting, and so on. This has influenced many other journals, many publications, much education, and even to some extent practice, where many accounting academics are interacting with politicians, for example, in the UK, in order to try to change accounting and audit. The paper that I'm going to kind of relate to, which is this Chatsiv Gary et al. I put on at the beginning, apart from obviously the authors themselves, are writers on accountability like John Roberts, Martin Messner, Gallofer and Haslam, that's me, and Mike Power. These authors are all referenced in the Chatsiv Gary et al. Paper. And they all kind of are interested in developing a critique of transparency, but also a critique of accounting generally, a critique of auditing, a critique of accountability, these kind of interrelated ideas. So here are some of the types, and this is not exhaustive, but here are some of the points that have been made about transparency and audit and so on. The practice and regulation of accounting and related phenomena may in part be about serving practitioners and established institutions of these phenomena. It's about serving them, not serving society. They're serving themselves. You know, they're getting fees, they are avoiding too much legal exposure, so they're quite conservative in what they disclose. And, you know, they get lots of resources themselves and status from doing these activity. Interestingly enough, Bentham himself made this point when he said, the real purpose of the language of accounting practice is a mystery that is reflecting the interests of the practitioners themselves. Yeah.
For production, for journals,
yes.
papers, position is searching all over the world.
Yes,
but
yes.
For innovation, position 59, that is to say, we have difficulties to transform this knowledge, real application, engineering, medicine,
yes.
different areas.
Yes.
This is the challenge.
Yes.
To make this connection.
Yes. No, I agree. I agree. Just been to a conference in Colombia where a man called Leslie Chan from Canada was speaking. Do you know him? You'd be interested in his, because it's precisely about those kind of issues. I'll find that for you. It's a good point, very good point. Secondly, could an accounting or accounting type initiative be something like a token gesture? Not really substance, just kind of on the surface. Could the tokenism even render an accounting type initiative something like fraud itself? Accounting and accounting type phenomena have many consequences, reflecting a sort of ambivalence or ambiguity. Some developments are unanticipated and unintended. The famous Nobel Prize winner in economics, Joseph Stiglitz, writes that when we make aspects of a company visible to the public, when we produce information about the company in the public realm, we don't know how it's going to be used and who will use it. You know, these are the unanticipated and unintended consequences and how it will be used. Accounting type phenomena are social, contextual, and reflect as well as shape the context of which they are part. This equates to difference between places over time, and we've seen difference and change in history and difference across the world. This complexity is difficult to grasp, but we should be concerned to evaluate accounting and related phenomena. Nevertheless, it's quite a subjective thing to do in practice, to evaluate something so complex. Does one size of accounting prescription fit all? This is another question, you know, is it the case that, for instance, these kind of accounting rules, they seem to be quite universal, but how are they going to be received and understood in different contexts of the world? Accounting type phenomena may never be absolutely captured by anyone, but they may be relatively captured by the relatively powerful, if imperfectly perhaps, and in ways that on close analysis may even be contradictory. And again, I go back to something I said before about conventional accounting practice, what we think of as very almost conservative, conventional conservative practice, such as the disclosure of accounts by banks. There was a time in history when such disclosure was considered to be very radical and associated with events like the French Revolution. This is honestly the case. So you go back to the 1830s and you've got a parliamentary committee in Britain and they're discussing banking crises of the 1830s. And around the table, you've got lawyers and merchants. No one called an accountant then because, I guess because there was no formally organized profession. But the people around the table understood accounting as a practice. And quite a number of them said, if you want to avoid the crisis, get the banks to produce their accounts, show them to the world. And the people on the committee said, wow, that's a big thing. You can't do that. What will people want next? If that is disclosed, what will people want next? So, and actually someone even said, you know, this will lead to revolution. You know, and they were only talking about external accounting disclosures that we today think are conservative, conventional practice. The manifestation and presentation of one phenomenon may displace alternatives to it. In other words, if you make a requirement, oh, that should be done, that should be disclosed, you're also displacing alternatives to that, which might be alternative disclosures or alternative regulations. It's possible that accounting type phenomena come to be trusted, maybe because they're associated with expertise, professionalism, state laws, all of those things in certain contexts could be trusted. And that those publishing accounts may gain some of that trust for companies themselves. Accounting may be seen as objective, factual, neutral, professional, and expert. But those things can change over time. Or is it, and now that could be a problem because people trust them and they don't worry about them, they don't investigate them. So instead of investigating things, maybe even the media don't investigate things as much because these accounting practices are there. There's a dark side to that. There's a weak side to that because you actually might be reducing accountability rather than increasing it. Is it that accounting type phenomena are difficult to understand and or to challenge? If that's the case, that would be a problem, especially if you're trying to get people to be concerned about these kinds of issues. Are the accounting type phenomena and the associated reporters and so on worthy of the trust referred to? Or are they trusted too much? Does it matter that many do not understand and or challenge them? They may be seen as political, simplification, narrow, subject to measurement issues, surface level, tick box exercise, and in these ways problematic in terms of how we think and behave. Moreover, of course, accounting type phenomena are not free, they are costly. So when you're talking about the benefits of something like transparency, this is not a free good. This is a costly thing. It's worth pointing out because other than Stiglitz and of course the whole range of information economics literature, there's a lot of literature in economics, for instance, that assumes that the information is simply there, when of course it's actually costly. The formal prescription that may be in accounting type practices may become overly dominant and restrict autonomy. The impact on the accountee or auditee, the person doing the account, the person doing the audit, the company doing the account or audit, behavior could be problematic. The transparency and accountability systems can lead to a blame culture or an emphasis on punishment and other instrumentalist behavior that is actually less than concerned to secure the noble aims ostensibly underlying the practices. So, lots of issues that people have raised about accounting in practice. But we can't, of course, simply leave the argument there, because along with the positive is the negative. Along with the negative is the positive. The possibility, indeed the actuality, of some good coming about from these disclosure practices. Gallagher and Haslam, sorry, not 1919. Believe it or not, I was not born in 1919. That means 2019. Our revised version, 100 pages, argue that the best way to do accounting is as a mix of emancipatory and repressive forces at any moment in time. In other words, accounting, like most social phenomena, is going to be a mix of kind of more progressive, positive forces, but also more negative, repressive forces. At any moment in time, that will be the case. To look at it, you need to look at the detail. You need to look at the detail of practice to appreciate that. It can come to be more or less emancipatory, including through human aid. So it can actually change. It can actually have these effects, these tendencies, and it can be changed in that way. But progressive change is a real challenge. Gallagher et al. 2015 see the actuality and potentiality of accounting serving an array of progressive interests, identities, and projects. These are the possibilities. And of course, this was recognized in a strange way by writers like Bentham in the 18th century, who linked accounting, for example, to the reduction of poverty, who linked accounting to democracy. Bentham did that as well. The very word publicity, accounting publicity, suggests something like democracy. We've kind of lost touch of that in many kind of European and global contexts. But there are countries in Europe, like in Scandinavia, for instance, where they talk about publicity law. I think Germany had something called Publicitätsgesetz, publicity law. And that's what they mean. When they say publicity, they mean disclosure to the public. And at the end of that Chatsiv-Gary et al. Paper, it says there's a danger in appreciating the negatives predominant in critical discourse, because critical discourse tends to just be critical, tends to be looking at the negative most of the time. There's a danger of overlooking or misinterpreting progressive actualities and potentialities of accounting and related systems. Now, to me, this kind of disclosure is fascinating to study because on the one hand, it involves some kind of voluntarism in the form of the EITI, where companies and governments and civil society are trying to get together. I say civil society, it's the big transnational NGOs that are getting together. On the other hand, it's actually legislation that's been introduced into government. First, it was done by Obama in the US. And as we know, it didn't really happen in practice. But, you know, that is a fascinating phenomenon that government was actually requiring this disclosure. And just another reference back to Bentham. Bentham somewhat naively advocated a principle which he referred to as unofficial publicity. Unofficial publicity, by which he meant that the government should give money to independent organizations, and that money would be used to criticize the government, This is such a naive idea, but you can see he definitely had good intentions, Bentham, in so many areas. He basically was advocating a system where the government would give money to these organizations and say, okay, criticize us. Criticize us, you know, make it visible, find problems with us. And he called that unofficial publicity because it wasn't coming from the state. Today we call that something like shadow accounting or counter accounting. But coming from the state is really strange, isn't it? And is that a bit like this? Is that a bit like this? You know, the government is requiring something that will end up having impacts that are actually quite critical of companies in the state, who are normally seen as part of the established order, you know. Okay, are we going to get on to the third slide now? I'm trying to go through these things as quickly as I can because I don't want to keep you all day, all day. And I'd like to hear some questions from you. Okay, so this is the final slide. It's called an analysis of the EU accounting and transparency law, and it's based mainly on that paper that I put up at the beginning. Chapter 10 of the European Union's Accounting Directive. Note that it went into the Accounting Directive. I would definitely call it financial accounting, but there's all kinds of institutional arrangements in the European Union. I mean, the International Accounting Standards Board's accounting rules, or standards, are sometimes seen in the EU as accounting. You know, that is accounting. What the International Accounting Standards Board says is accounting. Now, we've already pointed out that the International Accounting Standards Board does not require this. So, but this went into the Accounting Directive. It's all complicated, you know. Things sometimes fall through holes in these regimes. They fall into what we might call institutional voids. Because, oh, that's either non-financial reporting or it's financial reporting. But financial reporting, that's really what the IASB talk about. And this seems to be financial. So where does that go, you know? This kind of debate goes on, not just in the EU, but all the different countries within the EU. It gets very complicated. All the time, there's a potential for pushing something out, displacing it, all the time. Even when these things were introduced, of course, in the EU, it's subject to a review process. So there's a review done by the EU of these laws after maybe as short a time as 3 years. And then there's a review done by the countries within the EU separately, sometimes earlier than 3 years. So chapter 10 requires extractive companies, so oil, gas, mining, domiciled in scope means big enough, domiciled in member states, to each publish a report on payments to governments, a RPG, report on payments to governments. So this kind of thing here. The equivalent to the EU Transparency Directive, requiring scope companies listed on the EU stock exchanges to each publish a repayment to government. And I can let's carry on. We focus on the UK, an EU country at the time of the study, and actually still following this EU law in practice, because there's a tension between the Commons and the Lords. The Commons, dominated by the government party, want to throw these things out. The Lords, strangely enough, the Lords want to support these laws, you know. So our House of Lords has become more radical than our House of Commons in the current time. The authors draw from an appreciation of emancipatory accounting theory and critical theory of transparency. The European Commission in 2013 highlighted the law's benefits. It will allow communities to better demand that government accounts for how the money has been spent locally. And civil society will be in a position to question whether the contracts entered into between government and extractives have delivered adequate value to society and government. These are the actual text from the law, showing that the resource cost logic is very much there. Country by country reporting was here not only prescribed on an aggregate level, but also on a project basis. In other words, the EU went further and they were disclosing on a project level, not contracts, but this means that a bundle of contracts together were being disclosed. And the philosophy behind it was a particular region, for example, say of Nigeria, like the Niger Delta region, you would be disclosing the payments made from that region to the Nigerian government. And not just the central government, but also local governments in Nigeria. And then you could actually say, look how much money is coming from the Niger Delta into the government, and look at the mess that the Niger Delta is in. You know, you could say things like that. There were obvious loopholes here for companies because there was no real prescriptive guidance on how many contracts you bundle together. So for example, some of the really big transnationals, Shell, BP, these kind of transnationals, they were bundling together all the projects, say, for the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf of Mexico is a massive area in terms of all the contracts there. And they were bundling all that together and said, oh, it's all the Gulf of Mexico, so we'll put it together. So that, you know, their aggregation was quite high. And so they were losing lots of information that way. But I think it's fascinating that the EU was actually requiring projects. By the way, country by country reporting, you can see that this is a kind of country by country reporting because every government is included, and indeed, not just the national, but the local governments, I will stress that. However, if you want to know technically what country by country reporting is in its original formulation, have a look at the work of Richard Murphy. It's even more detailed. And what Murphy was trying to do, and he's still trying to do this, was to disclose sufficient information and they do it just about within the scope of the law. So they call it avoiding rather than evading. But it's aggressive aggressive tax avoidance, and Murphy was trying to get at aggressive tax avoidance to reverse the tendency that has happened where big corporations are paying less and less tax. And the tax is therefore falling on others, such as everybody here, maybe, you know, and myself. The European Commission followed the US lead, the lead of Obama, the Frank Dodd Act, in not requiring an audit. Section 504 of the US Dodd-Frank law did not require audit. There's also no requirement for reconciliation to audited financial statements, because that would be another alternative. You could reconcile the reports on payments to government to those financial statements that are audited and hence have some audit dimension. But that wasn't required either. The NGOs in the main wanted audit, although there were some views opposite to that, because they didn't, some of the NGO people did not trust auditors, or they actually had a problem with auditors, such as Prem Sikka. You know, I don't know if you've heard of Prem Sikka. He's a famous activist in the UK. Many years ago, when he was doing his PhD, Prem's actually older than me. There are still people older than me in academia. But Prem, many years ago, when he was asked for a report from a large audit firm, and he was told that the report was confidential, but actually the report came out in public almost the day after he got that message. And Prem was really concerned about the practices of the audit profession from that day onwards. And he's now kind of very influential in kind of the area of audit reform, having convinced the main political parties actually of the need for reform of audit. And he's very much respected by the auditing profession now. They're very careful in how they deal with Prem. But that is a negotiation that carries. I'm trying to portray the company, or I seem to be portraying the companies as basically opposed to these disclosures. But there is a sense in which some of the larger companies, with their corporate social responsibility visions and their concern to stabilize the situation, to stabilize regulation, were actually quite supportive of these laws, you know, which you might be surprised by. But I've been on various committees, because I was invited to various committees involving companies as well as the NGOs. And there were representatives of these companies, including big mining organizations. And they were actually saying, yes, we want this. We support this legislation. We want to support this legislation. I spoke to people in Europe, and they said, we're not the bad guys. We want to support this legislation. So I think they also see an interest in stabilizing legislation. And you know, if you ask them questions about the development of the various resource-rich societies, they will agree with you. You know, I mean, if you say to them, don't you want to see the development of the resource-rich societies? They say, oh yes, that's a good thing. I spoke to people in the UK government and the Business and Innovation Services Department, and I asked them, you know, why are you so concerned about the these disclosures for the local people in these countries all over the world? And they said, well, partly it's because we're interested in development. We want these countries to develop economically, and then we can establish good trading relationships with them. We don't want refugee crises. So we want these countries to be quite rich, so we don't have the refugee crisis which we envisage happening, into the future. So all kinds of reasons behind this, behind these things. The UK was the first EU country at the time implementing the law. It actually implemented it earlier, requiring disclosure for financial years starting on or after the 1st of January 2015. Interestingly enough, the UK is the country then in the EU that had the most natural resource interest, the most oil and gas and mining interests. The second one was France, and interestingly enough, France was the second country to implement the law. And I think that does indicate that the governments and companies in these countries were quite happy about these laws. I think it does indicate that. And even the Conservative administration in Britain, like Cameron and Osborne at the time, David Cameron, George Osborne, they were quite supportive of this. And I can remember that some companies did lobby in terms of, oh, we don't think there should be penalties in the early years for companies that don't disclose. Can we leave the compliance for a year? We're supportive, but can you actually, you don't have to introduce it early. And Cameron and Osborne introduced it early with the penalties. Quite interesting. The law is subject to review and soon after implementation to assess its usefulness. The UK decided to be the first to review. So arguably one reason why the UK did this early was so it could review it early. But that review has not been a negative review, interestingly enough. A government ministry via its civil service invited comment on a discussion paper, UK implementation of the EU Directive, Chapter 10, Extractive Industries Reporting. This reflects a limited autonomy that the UK government had in transposing the law. In principle, the autonomy is confined to the nature of the penalties and the precise timing of the law's introduction. But the penalties were kept and the timing was advanced. The industry claimed penalties were excessive, wanted the law implemented later. The NGO campaigners supported penalties and sought early implementation. And the NGOs appeared to win this. Civil society continued to stress that not only would the law help the poorer people in the resource-rich countries, but also could help investors. Because investors could see this information and it could inform the kind of appreciation of the risk of investing in the company. For instance, oh, this company doesn't seem to pay very much in this country. Or this company is operating in a very unstable country environment. And as a result of that, they could refine their investment portfolios. By the way, we have done studies on investors, and when you tell them about this information, they're actually quite interested in it, but most of them didn't know anything about the information. In fact, most of them were embarrassed. We were interviewing more ethical investors, you might say, who were arguing that they had a socially responsible agenda and they were investing only in green companies and socially responsible companies. And there was one man we were interviewing, a director of a company like that, and halfway through the interview, he turned the tape off. He said, "I'm sorry, I'm embarrassed. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what this information is." Civil society argued that some extractives were exaggerating compliance costs, competitive disadvantage, commercial risk, legal prohibitions, because in some cases, countries were saying that if you disclose this information, end of contract. Actually, these things seem to be exaggerated because in practice, there hasn't been much impact reported by the companies from this disclosure. But companies often use these kind of arguments, and usually the accountancy profession supports them. So if you look at the arguments made in relation to consultation, the companies will tend to make these arguments. The accountancy profession will also make these arguments. In practice, they seem to be relatively happy because they haven't experienced this. For the NGOs, project by project, or even better, contract by contract reporting was seen as very important. By the way, if you think contract by contract reporting is an incredibly wild idea and very detailed, it is, but the EITI is now doing that in some cases. They are disclosing the contracts. They have managed to secure a voluntary agreement on contract disclosure. Was seen as very important because significant corruption on the revenue side was seen as happening at the project level. The accountancy firms, interestingly enough, use the discourse of the critique of transparency that I spoke about before, which is an amazing thing. They actually use the critique of transparency discourse to object to some of these things. They say, oh, it's just a tick box exercise. Oh, it's just a list of numbers. But they're in the business of lists of numbers. That's what they do. That's what the accounting profession often does. But they were saying that's all it is. They also highlighted costs and the disproportionate burden placed on UK companies. They compared themselves to the US companies who were not really implementing that law. And they highlight the potential for adverse consequences for companies of putting commercially sensitive data into the public domain. Heavy penalties might deter companies and also reduce the foreign investment that actually promoted anti-corrupt business. In other words, the foreign investment that comes into these countries can actually promote the anti-corruption activity, and this will be reduced if you require too many stringent disclosure rules. I spoke to the man who wrote the industry guidance because the government encouraged industry and civil society to work together to produce guidance. But we're clear that it is industry that is best placed to develop the guidance. And I spoke to the man who wrote the guidance, who was a big director of one of the big oil companies. Civil society said there was poor consultation. There were arguments over the industry guidance, which was seeking minimal compliance from the campaigner's perspective. I spoke to a barrister, a lawyer in London, who was an advisor to these people. He was an advisor to these people. And he said that basically what the industry guidance was about, they were trying to push the law to its limits in terms of their interests. And really, they would not have been successful, in his view. They were on the wrong side of the law, really, what they were suggesting. But the same man, the same man said he was basically supportive of this law as well. So the guidelines had a broad interpretation of this idea of substantially interconnected. This is this idea of projects. Projects were meant to be substantially interconnected contracts, but in practice, some companies had the whole of the Gulf of Mexico. Yeah, BP and Shell. And then, according to the industry guidelines, payments made on behalf of participants in joint ventures by the operator should be reported by the operator, not by the joint venture participant on whose behalf the payments are made. This suggested a possible loophole in terms of complying with the principle of this disclosure. So the industry guidelines were trying to give companies a loophole in terms of the detail that they were disclosing. Although in practice, we found no real evidence that companies were materially, that should be advantage, were materially taking advantage of this. In practice, the companies were not trying to avoid disclosure in this way, as far as we could see. we found some evidence of non-compliance. This was by UK companies. We did a later study on companies throughout the EU, and we found similar results. Some evidence of non-compliance, but nothing material, not really any significant non-compliance. One company disclosed they made payments in kind, but have not complied with requirements to explain, give the value and volume. You know, most of the things that they didn't do were not very material. BP noted that, you know, we're a state-owned enterprise, undertakes activities outside of its own jurisdiction. This is not considered to be a government. So again, trying to take advantage of possible interpretation of the law to avoid disclosure. We did find some things, but overall, you have to say that companies have complied pretty much with the legislation. Some companies have made additional voluntary disclosures, indicating that the directive could be increased in scope and cover more things. Another interesting phenomenon that happens, especially when you get more voluntary disclosures such as the EITI, but also prescribed legal disclosures where companies might do more, you potentially do the opposite of creating a race to the bottom. Sometimes we talk about a race to the bottom, and one way of trying to avoid that is to get coordination across different jurisdictions. But there's also this idea of the race to the top, where companies compete with each other about their ethical disclosures. And indeed, one reason why they quite like to have disclosures cutting across different countries is so that they will not have that pressure to compete. But still, some of them compete. And I remember that in the case of the EITI, we did a study on Trinidad, and the leader of the Oil and Workers Trade Union in Trinidad said, oh, we can use the EITI to raise our disclosures. Because what I've been saying is, look at what they do in Peru. Why can't we do that in Trinidad? You know, and so these differences that you find in these systems are sometimes used to kind of push a race to the top rather than a race to the bottom. Some did limited independent assurance reports. And actually, when I spoke to that director, former director of Shell in a cafe in London, he said, Luke, if you want to see an audit of this information, okay, but make it a limited audit. Make it a limited, because there's such a thing as a limited independent assurance report, but better than nothing, you could argue. And some do reconciliations of tax payments to audited financial reports. Some were voluntarily doing these things. And some disclaimers may indicate things that could be disclosed. So aspects of the report content threaten to undermine the usefulness, but there are limits to the law subversion, and some of the voluntary practice enhance the validity of reports, maybe suggesting corporate strategy. Reports are being used and in ways the legislation ostensibly anticipated. So the reports were being used to some extent for the purposes they were envisaged to be used on the face of it. There is appreciation of limitations. Now, this is also important to remind ourselves of, because one of the things we said in terms of the critique of transparency was that the NGOs might just think, oh, this information is great and we don't need to look for additional information. But they are looking for additional information. And they are being critical of the limitations. I think that's partly because the NGOs were working with people who were critical of accounting and audit practices. They were working with people who had good understanding of accounting and audit practices. So they weren't afraid to challenge them. They were still doing their investigative journalism. The issues of form and aura are of limited significance for the civil society campaign. So we didn't see big issues of form, in other words, the way in which the information was disclosed. We did find, I think it was in Cyprus, when we did our EU study. In Cyprus, this information was sent to an official registry. And in order to access the information, you had to pay a few £100 to get the information. We did see that as a kind of issue of form, maybe. As far as Aura is concerned, we didn't really see any kind of issue where people were put off questioning this because they thought it was too professional, too expert, too detailed. And also, on the other hand, they didn't see it as fraudulent disclosure or anything like that. So the Aura dimension was not so important in this case. It was acknowledged that states have a general interest in their revenues and in global socioeconomic development. In other words, one of the reasons behind this, from the state's point of view, was that they were also interested in their revenues. And they saw companies, the big companies throughout the world, trying to avoid paying revenues to all the governments, including them. And when there is non-compliance in the UK, the Secretary of State or the Director of Public Prosecutions must agree to any prosecution brought. This was seen as a kind of limitation. That's a big thing. So it's going to be difficult to challenge companies when they don't actually comply. You know, if a campaigner said this is really poor compliance, it's going to be difficult to get, for example, the Secretary of State or the Director of Public Prosecutions, these very senior figures, to agree to any prosecution. Okay, thank you very much. That's my end of my presentation, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Jane, for your amazing speak. Now, questions, the audience. I have two questions. One of them is about the campaigns. Back to the another lectures that you made. So, what kind of accounts can be mobilized by these campaigns, like emancipatory, geologic account, counter account, but also the conventional? How you feel? How do you think about it? The campaigns in this phenomena. And back to the beginning of the speak, you talking about the resource, the natural resource of the countries. And you can realize it about the Australia that had a huge budget in security to protect the natural resource. Do you think this is the key to protect the
those questions? I mean, going back to the point that Stiglitz made about, you know, you're not quite sure what will happen in terms of these disclosures. For instance, in the case of Trinidad with the EITI, Trinidad and Tobago signed up to the EITI. And information became available. They already had quite a lot of information available in Trinidad and Tobago. They've got, you know, years of experience running extractive industries and natural resource governance. But they signed up. They wanted to be a kind of good international, you know, partner and be parts of the team trying to control these issues. And then people started to kind of debate these things because, you know, new transparency, if you like, comes around, or a new form of transparency comes around, and then they debate them. So Trinidad is a country with a lot of democratic traditions and interesting civil society, usually quite small civil society organizations. And they had meetings beyond the EITI meetings. So the EITI themselves were holding meetings in Trinidad, talking to local people about this information. But in addition to that, you had, say, journalists or campaigners within Trinidad having meetings with local people. You know, I should point out that natural resources are really important, as a big issue in Trinidad. And, you know, this definitely got some interesting views that being expressed by the local people. And linked to that, you've also got concerns about the environment coming through, because what's happened with the EITI is it's not just concentrated on the financial aspects, It's also concentrated on gender aspects, environmental aspects. So it's expanded its scope. And local environmental campaigners are using the information, even though they don't really trust the EITI. They think it's a World Bank initiative. Arguably it is. You know, the World Bank certainly monitor it, and the people who were involved in the original development of the EITI were partly World Bank people. The very first president was from the World Bank. You know, and so they don't really trust it. They think it's a World Bank initiative, but they see that information that's coming through as being useful in their environmental campaigns. Local environmental campaigns about the protection of various flooding being used for quite progressive purposes. Some of it related to the original formulation and some of it not, some of it going beyond it. You talked about Australia. When you say protection of natural resources, what do you mean by that? Do you mean, for example, the native people concerned about their land? Is that the sort of, yes. Yeah. Basically, there have been issues going in both directions there. I think there's some evidence in Canada of the indigenous populations of Canada about the disclosures for some reason. There is some work done by David Cooper on that particular issue. And it was like the disclosures were raising issues whereby they didn't want to disclose this information in terms of how much money was paid in relation to these particular lands. And I haven't really seen the issue being particularly prominent in Australia as far as these disclosures are concerned. There was some debate in Australia about these disclosures. They wanted to introduce them, but I don't think they were introduced in the end. EITI disclosures, I think they do. But the actual legislative prescription, no, they haven't done it. And I haven't really seen an issue coming about related to that kind of disclosure and the protection of it. I mean, there are massive debates about the protection of the land and trying to avoid the, destruction of the local the local culture's land. Yeah, there are big debates about that. Although usually they try to make some kind of negotiated agreement because the value to the Australian economy is seen as so significant. So they do actually do the extraction usually, and then somehow try to compensate local people. But obviously, if the land is sacred, which it would be in that context, it would be sacred to the local people. You can't really compensate them for that. Okay, does that make sense?
So then, from the audience online, Sandra says, congratulations, Jim, for the reflections that you need in accounting. Also, Monica is very interested about the presentation. They say congratulations for you and regards from all the Argentina. So
thank you very much.
So I think you don't have more questions for the audience. So I would like to say many thanks for your presentations, for your lectures here. On behalf of the coordinations and the director of the FACC.
Thank you very much.
So, thank you, Jen, for your presentation.
Thank you.
I'd like to invite Marcelo Alvarez, the director here, to give you a little bit gift.
Oh, wow. One more gift. You know, I came with bags and they're absolutely full. Thank you, Marcelo. Thank you. Oh, this is a gift. Wow. Oh, well, how am I going to get these things back? Oh, this is Mate, which is one of my favorite drinks now. Oh, wow. Look at that. Fantastic. I hope they've got an extra large one for me. This is really good.
Let's take a picture.
Yeah. This is great. All right. Thank you very much. Some more pictures are coming there. Okay. That's fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jen.
That's
on
brilliant.
behalf
Yeah,
of
I
and,
definitely
everyone.
wanted
Yeah.
this shirt. Yeah,
Thank you.
brilliant.